And people see that with Eamonn and I on TV, you know. So I say, well, we don't row, actually. And people say, well, they argue. I say, we don't. It's just I don't always agree with him. And just because he's my husband, I'll never always agree with him. So, and I can't be that person that doesn't voice that opinion.
Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford seemed unshakable, the kind of marriage that made people believe in forever, steady, reliable, admired by millions. When they announced their divorce, the world was stunned. There had been no signs, no scandals, nothing. Ruth spoke first. Her version sounded reasonable, and everyone believed her. Eamonn said nothing, and his silence felt like guilt. Now Eamonn Holmes has finally broken that silence, and what he reveals changes everything people thought they knew. What was really happening behind closed doors? Join us as we expose the truth of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. A marriage built on performance. Everyone thought they knew Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford, the breakfast television couple who smiled at each other across the sofa every morning, laughing at the same jokes and finishing each other's sentences in a way that made viewers feel comfortable. But comfort is not the same as closeness. For over 20 years, their relationship existed mostly on camera, meeting at work, falling in love at work, getting married while working together, and then continuing year after year, broadcasting their marriage to millions of people who believed they were watching something real. Maybe it was real once before the cameras became part of the furniture, when there were private moments that belonged only to them, quiet mornings and inside jokes, the kind of intimacy that does not need an audience. But television has a way of swallowing things whole. When you are paid to be charming together 5 days a week, charm stops being spontaneous and becomes a muscle you exercise, a skill you refine, learning which stories get laughs, which glances the camera loves, which version of yourselves the audience wants to see. And slowly, without realizing it, that version becomes the only version you know how to be. Eamonn and Ruth were professionals who understood what the job required. Chemistry on demand, banter that felt natural but hit its marks. A marriage that looked effortless because they had practiced it so many times. Because when your relationship is also your brand, it becomes difficult to separate what is genuine from what is simply good television. You stop asking whether you are happy and start asking whether you look happy. And if the audience believes it, does the truth even matter? No one suspected anything was wrong because nothing ever looked wrong. No public arguments, no scandals, no rumors, just two people who had been together so long that their presence beside each other seemed inevitable. But inevitability is not love. It is just familiarity that has lasted long enough to feel permanent. The danger of performing a marriage is that eventually the performance replaces the reality. You stop checking in with each other because you already know your lines. You stop being curious because you assume you know everything. You stop growing because growth would disrupt the routine. They stopped talking about the things that mattered, stopped asking each other how they really felt, because the answer might have been too complicated, too messy, too real for two people who had spent decades pretending everything was fine. Until one day, the pretending stopped working. The divorce announcement came without warning. One short statement with no details, no explanation, just the fact that after all those years, it was over. What happens when one person controls the story after everything falls apart? And what does silence cost when the world has already decided who to believe? When one voice controls the narrative. Within hours of the divorce announcement, Ruth spoke, and her version of events began to circulate, not through angry interviews or tearful confessions, but through carefully chosen words delivered to the right people at the right time. Friends who spoke to journalists, sources close to the family, statements that felt measured and reasonable and impossible to argue against. She described a marriage that had run its course, Two people who had grown apart naturally, the way couples sometimes do after decades together. No villains, no drama, just the sad, inevitable end of something that had once been good. And because Ruth had always been seen as the sensible one, the organized one, the steady presence beside Eamonn's louder personality, people believed her without question. Eamonn said nothing, and his silence became part of Ruth's narrative. Why was he not defending himself? Why was he not sharing his side? Surely, if there was more to the story, he would speak up. And when he did not, people began to assume the worst, that perhaps he had done something he could not explain away, that perhaps Ruth's calm disappointment was actually remarkable restraint. Ruth did not need to accuse Eamonn of anything specific. She simply needed to position herself as the reasonable party, the one who had tried, the one who had stayed, the one who was now moving forward with dignity while he remained silent and therefore suspicious. And it worked. Public opinion solidified quickly, sympathy flowed in her direction, support from colleagues and fans who admired her grace under pressure. By the time Eamonn was ready to speak, the narrative was already set, and changing a story that has already been believed is almost impossible. But what happens to a person when they are trapped inside someone else's version of their life, unable to move or speak or defend themselves in ways that go far beyond words? Silence as survival. Eamonn's silence was not a choice. It was a calculation. He knew that anything he said would be measured against Ruth's version, dissected by tabloids, twisted into headlines that served whatever narrative sold best that week. And in that environment, silence felt like the only move that could not be used against him. But silence has a cost that nobody warns you about. Every day he did not speak. The assumptions grew stronger. Friends stopped reaching out because they did not know what to believe. Colleagues became awkward around him, maintaining professional distance in case the truth turned out to be something they did not want to be associated with. And the public, already convinced by Ruth's calm testimony, filled in the blanks with their own worst guesses. He was called cold, emotionally absent, someone who had checked out of the marriage years ago, someone who probably had secrets he could not afford to share. And because he did not deny any of it, people assumed all of it must be true. This is the trap of public silence. It protects you from saying the wrong thing, but it cannot protect you from what others will say in your absence. And once those assumptions harden into accepted facts, they become almost impossible to dislodge. Eamonn watched his own life be explained by people who had never lived it. Therapists on morning television analyzing his behavior, relationship experts diagnosing his failures, columnists writing think pieces about what his silence revealed about masculinity and accountability, and the refusal to take responsibility. None of them knew what had actually happened, but all of them were certain they understood. The emotional cost of being misunderstood in public is not just about reputation. It is about watching yourself become a character in someone else's story. A version of you that does not match who you know yourself to be, but that everyone else accepts as truth. And the loneliness of that experience is profound. You cannot defend yourself without seeming defensive. You cannot explain without seeming like you are making excuses. You cannot ask for understanding because the verdict has already been delivered. So Eamonn stayed quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew that in the court of public opinion, silence was still safer than speech, even if safety meant isolation, even if isolation meant being completely alone inside a story that was supposed to be about his own life. But his silence was not just strategic, it was also physical, because something far more devastating than public judgment had already begun to take hold of his body, a body that became a prison. The pain started small, a stiffness in his back that he ignored for months, the kind of discomfort that middle-aged bodies are expected to tolerate, something that physio and painkillers should eventually fix. But it did not fix It spread and deepened and transformed into something that controlled every part of his day. How he sat, how he stood, whether he could sleep, whether he could work, whether he could exist, without measuring every movement against the price it would cost him later. Chronic pain is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a single catastrophic moment. It simply erodes your life, one small compromise at a time, until you realize you are living inside a completely different reality than the one you remember. Eamonn's mobility shrank. Stairs became obstacles. Long days at the studio became unbearable. Even sitting through a dinner required planning and medication and the constant mental calculation of whether the evening would be worth the suffering that would follow. And with the loss of mobility came the loss of independence. Suddenly, he needed help with things he had done without thinking his entire adult life. Getting dressed, carrying shopping, moving through spaces that had never seemed difficult before. This is where illness rewrites the rules of a relationship, because needing help makes you vulnerable in ways that love is supposed to protect against. But vulnerability also creates imbalance, and imbalance creates power, and power changes everything. Ruth became the person he relied on, not just emotionally, but practically. She drove him places, managed his appointments, made decisions about his care, and at first this seemed like devotion, the natural response of a partner who wants to help. But dependence has a way of shifting the architecture of a marriage, when one person holds all the power to grant or withhold assistance, to decide what is reasonable and what is asking too much, to determine what you are capable of better than you can yourself. The relationship stops being a partnership and becomes something else entirely. Eamonn found himself negotiating for things that should not require negotiation, asking permission for decisions that used to be his own, adjusting his needs to fit what felt acceptable within the new structure of their life together, and slowly, without either of them naming it directly, his body became the justification for everything that followed. Because when someone controls your physical reality, it becomes almost impossible to see when they begin controlling everything else. Care that slowly turns into control. At first, Ruth's involvement felt like love. She researched his condition, booked the best specialists, organized his medication schedule, made sure he was following doctor's orders, and to everyone watching, including Eamonn himself, this looked like exactly what a devoted partner should do. But care and control exist on a spectrum, and the line between them is thinner than most people realize, especially when the person being cared for is too exhausted or too grateful or too dependent to notice when that line gets crossed. It started with small things, Ruth suggesting he should not attend certain events because they would be too tiring, deciding which social invitations to accept on his behalf because she knew his limits better than he did, managing his schedule in ways that felt helpful but slowly removed his ability to make those choices himself. And because her reasoning always sounded sensible, always framed around his well-being, it became difficult to push back without seeming ungrateful or self-destructive. How could he argue when she was only trying to help, when she was the one managing everything while he could barely manage his own pain? This is how control embeds itself inside care. It uses concern as camouflage. Every boundary it crosses is justified by protection. Every decision it makes is framed as being for your own good, and if you resist, you are not asserting independence. You are being difficult, unreasonable, failing to appreciate the sacrifice being made on your behalf. Eamonn began to notice that conversations about what he wanted were gradually replaced by conversations about what was realistic, what made sense, what would be easier for everyone, and his own preferences started to feel selfish against the weight of Ruth's practical management of their lives. She controlled his access to the outside world in ways that seemed logistical but had deeper consequences. She decided who he saw and when, how long visits should last, which phone calls were worth the energy and which would only upset him. And slowly his connections to other people began to narrow until most of his social contact was filtered through her first. And the most insidious part was that none of it looked abusive. It looked like devotion. Ruth was praised by friends for her patience, admired for her commitment, seen as a woman who stayed beside her husband through difficult circumstances when many others would have left. But Eamonn was beginning to realize that being taken care of too completely is its own kind of trap. And the trap was not just emotional. It was spatial, because the house they shared was slowly becoming somewhere he could no longer breathe. The house that no longer felt safe. Home is supposed to be the place where you can stop performing, where you can let your guard down and exist without judgment. But for Eamonn, the house he shared with Ruth had become the opposite, a space where every word and movement felt monitored. It happened so gradually that he could not pinpoint when it started. Perhaps it was always there beneath the surface, and he only noticed once his world had shrunk small enough that the walls became impossible to ignore. Ruth always seemed to know where he was, what he was doing, who he was talking to, not through obvious surveillance, but through the constant low-level presence that comes from sharing space with someone who pays very close attention. She would appear in doorways during phone calls, ask casual questions about conversations she should not have overheard, make comments that revealed she knew details he had not shared. And when he mentioned feeling watched, she framed it as care, as the natural awareness that comes from worrying about someone whose health requires vigilance. How could she not pay attention when he might need help at any moment, when his condition meant that being unaware could be dangerous? So his discomfort became unreasonable, his need for privacy became suspicious, and he learned to adjust his behavior to avoid the tension that came from asserting boundaries she had decided were unnecessary. He stopped making phone calls when she was home, stopped expressing opinions that might lead to long, exhausting debates he no longer had energy for, stopped retreating to spaces that were supposed to be his, because even those felt penetrated by her presence. This is what emotional confinement looks like. It does not require locks or threats. It simply requires an environment where you are constantly aware of being observed, where spontaneity feels dangerous, where you edit yourself so automatically that you forget you are doing it. The house still looked normal from the outside, still had the same furniture and photos and routines that any long marriage accumulates, but the atmosphere inside had curdled into something tense and airless, a place where Eamonn felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, but had nowhere else to go. He began spending more time in his small office, the only room that still felt remotely his own. But even there, he could sense Ruth's awareness of his withdrawal, the subtle disapproval in her questions about what he was doing in there, why he needed so much time alone, whether he was hiding something. And maybe he was hiding something. He was hiding the growing realization that he was trapped, until one moment cracked the illusion open and showed him exactly what his marriage had become. The moment that exposed everything. The conversation was not meant for him to hear. Eamonn had been resting upstairs, exhausted from another difficult day, when he heard Ruth's voice drifting up from the kitchen. She was on the phone with someone, a friend perhaps. Her tone casual and relaxed in a way it rarely was around him anymore. He was not trying to listen, but sound carries in old houses, and once he caught the thread of what she was saying, he could not stop himself from paying attention. She was talking about him, describing his limitations with a detached clinical precision that made him sound like a burden she was managing rather than a husband she loved. She talked about his pain as if it were an inconvenience, his needs as if they were excessive, his presence as if it were something she had to strategically work around. But it was not the content that gutted him, it was the tone, the absence of affection or concern, the way she spoke about him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cared for. And beneath it all, something that sounded uncomfortably close to contempt. He sat frozen on the edge of the bed, listening to his wife describe their marriage to someone else, And nothing she said matched the version of reality she presented to him every day: the devoted partner, the tireless caregiver, the woman who was sacrificing so much to stand beside him. This is what betrayal feels like. Not a single dramatic act, but the sudden clarity that the person you trusted most has been performing a role. That the care you felt grateful for was actually resentment dressed up as duty. That you have been living inside a lie so complete you mistook it for love. When Ruth came upstairs later, he said nothing. He did not confront her or demand explanation because he already knew what she would say: that he had misunderstood, that he was being oversensitive, that his pain medication was making him paranoid. She would twist it until he doubted his own perception. So instead, he simply knew. And that knowledge changed everything. The conversation had not created the break in their marriage. It had simply revealed what had already been true for longer than he wanted to accept: that intimacy had died, that trust was gone, that they were two people living in the same house with completely different understandings of what their relationship actually was. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. But knowing the truth and being able to act on it are two entirely different things, especially when the world only wants to hear one version of the story. The sanitized ending. When the divorce was finally announced, the public statement was a masterpiece of careful language, brief and neutral, and designed to close down questions rather than invite them. It said nothing about pain or power or years of quiet suffocation, nothing about overheard conversations or surveillance disguised as care, nothing about the slow erosion of selfhood that happens when one person holds all the control. It simply acknowledged that the marriage had ended, wished each other well, and asked for privacy. Polite words masking emotional wreckage. This is how public relationships end. Not with truth, but with image management. Because admitting what actually happened would require both parties to acknowledge things they would rather keep hidden. And neither Eamonn nor Ruth were willing to do that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ruth continued to be praised for her grace and dignity, the way she handled the situation with such maturity, never speaking badly about Eamonn even though she would have been justified, people said, given everything she had endured. Eamonn stayed silent, still calculating, still trapped between wanting to speak and knowing that anything he said would be dismissed as bitterness or blame shifting. The predictable response of a man who could not accept responsibility for his failures. The statement protected them both in different ways. It allowed Ruth to maintain her reputation as the reasonable one, the victim of a marriage that simply did not work out. And it allowed Eamonn to avoid the circus that would follow if he tried to explain what had really happened behind closed doors. But protection and truth are not the same thing. And the sanitized version they presented to the world left enormous gaps where the actual story should have been. Friends and family were left confused. Colleagues tried to piece together what had gone wrong from fragments and rumors and body language at public events. Fans debated online about who was really at fault. And everyone filled the silence with their own assumptions because the only information they had was a 3-sentence statement that revealed nothing. This is the cost of discretion. It preserves privacy, but it also preserves lies. And when both parties agree to keep quiet, the truth stays buried under politeness and lawyers and carefully worded press releases. Eamonn knew that the real story was darker and more complicated than anyone would believe, and he was not sure anyone even wanted to hear it. Until finally, after months of silence, something inside him shifted, and he decided that being misunderstood forever was worse than the risk of speaking. When Eamonn finally breaks the silence, when Eamonn did eventually speak, it was not through a tabloid tell-all or a tearful television interview. It was in quieter moments, conversations with trusted journalists, carefully chosen words in settings where he could control the pace and framing. He did not accuse Ruth of specific cruelties. He did not list grievances or present evidence. Instead, he spoke about what it feels like to lose yourself inside a relationship, to become so small and so dependent that you forget you were ever anything else. He described the suffocation of living under constant observation, the exhaustion of negotiating for basic autonomy, the slow realization that care had become control, and control had become a cage he could not name because it looked too much like love. He talked about chronic pain, not as a medical condition, but as the thing that made him vulnerable, that gave someone else permission to make decisions on his behalf, that turned him from a partner into a patient whose needs could be managed rather than respected. And he spoke about the terror of losing his identity, of waking up one day and realizing he no longer recognized himself, that the person he had been before the pain and before the marriage collapsed had been eroded so completely that he was not sure that person still existed. This is what waiting does to truth. It makes it heavier, darker, harder to carry, because the longer you stay silent, the more you see, the more connections you make, the more you understand about what was actually happening while you were too close to recognize it. Eamonn did not frame himself as a victim. He was too aware of how that word would be weaponized against him. Instead, he simply described his experience and let people draw their own conclusions. And some did slowly, quietly, beginning to see that maybe the story was more complicated than Ruth's calm initial version had suggested. But many others dismissed him entirely, said he was rewriting history, that he was trying to destroy Ruth's reputation because he could not accept his own failures, that this was what men always do when they are caught. They claim emotional abuse and play the victim and expect sympathy they do not deserve. And perhaps that was inevitable. Perhaps once the narrative sets, no amount of truth can fully dislodge it. Perhaps Eamonn's mistake was waiting too long, letting Ruth's version calcify into accepted fact before offering his own. Or perhaps there was never a right time, never a way to speak that would have been believed. Because the truth about their marriage was not about who was right or wrong, it was about power, and how easily strength can devour the person standing closest to it. Strength that devours Ruth had always been the strong one. That was part of her appeal. She was organized and capable and unshakable, the person who held everything together while Eamonn provided the charm and humor. And for years that dynamic worked, because both of them had space to be themselves within it. But strength is not inherently good, it is neutral. And what matters is how it gets used, whether it lifts others up or presses them down, whether it creates safety or enforces compliance. In a relationship, the strongest partner often holds the most power, not through violence or obvious cruelty, but through sheer force of competence. They are the ones who know what needs to be done, who make things happen, who can justify their control by pointing to results. And if you are the weaker partner, the one who is struggling or sick, or simply less capable in that moment, it becomes very difficult to challenge someone whose strength is the only thing keeping your life functional. This is what happened to Eamonn. He became dependent on Ruth's strength, and that dependence gave her a kind of authority that neither of them fully acknowledged. She made decisions because she was better at making them. She took control because someone had to, and he accepted it because fighting her required energy he no longer had. But being taken care of too completely is dangerous. It erases your agency slowly enough that you do not notice until it is gone. You become someone things are done to and for, rather than someone who does things themselves. And once that shift happens, reversing it requires a kind of confrontation that feels impossible when you are already defeated. Ruth's strength was real, but it was also the thing that devoured him, because she wielded it without restraint, without checking whether he still had room to breathe, without asking if the help she was providing was actually helping, or just making him smaller. And maybe she did not realize what she was doing. Maybe she genuinely believed she was being supportive, that her management of his life was necessary rather than suffocating. Or maybe on some level she did know, and that knowledge was part of the power, the quiet satisfaction of being needed, of being essential, of being the only thing standing between him and complete collapse. Either way, the result was the same. A marriage where one person grew and the other shrank, where love became something you had to escape rather than something that set you free. And in the end, there were no winners, no closure, just two people walking away from wreckage they both helped create. A marriage that ended long before it collapsed. Two people who stayed together out of habit and fear and the weight of public expectation until staying became more unbearable than leaving. The cost of being unheard for too long, of swallowing your truth until it poisons you from the inside. Why some truths only surface once the door is closed, once escape becomes the only form of honesty left. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.